Chapter 15, November 27th, 1918. Tomorrow was Thanksgiving Day. Dr. Harvey was looking forward to dinner with May and her family. She'd invited him to share their meal and giving of thanks. That morning he'd driven his Hudson south on Reservation Creek Road. It was covered by an overnight dusting of snow, the first snowfall of the season. The temperature was 20 degrees Fahrenheit when he left town, but it felt colder here as he drove very, very slowly to avoid sliding into the ditch. The landscape was beautiful. Snow-covered fields lay on each side of the road. Pine trees on the bench, what local ranchers called the plateau, stood like sentinels watching over the land, and leafless trees lined the creek for which the road was named. He imagined Crow and Sioux on horseback riding in this area in the days before steamboats and railroads brought thousands to their country, before much of the land was taken from them through brute force and disease, before roads brought swift-moving, horseless carriages, when horseback riders would see and feel the majestic beauty of the land in a way drivers like him missed by passing through too quickly. As he pulled his coat more tightly against his body, he marveled at how the Crow, Sioux, and Northern Cheyenne and other tribes had survived in the short days and long nights of winter on these high plains, when temperatures were much colder than the still above zero chill he was bundled up against. Cattle congregated in a field on the east side of the road. They were clustered together side by side in small groups of 8 to 10. The exhaled breath of each formed a cloud that rose 8 to 10 inches over their nostrils before disappearing. These clouds looked like smoke puffed from steam engines. The cattle nuzzled the ground in search of grass, easier to find in April and May when these fields were covered by the annual miracle of regenerated landscape. This was the first time Dr. Harvey had been away from town and the influenza ward at the Masonic Lodge in more than 3 weeks. He was so lost in thought he did not notice a rider on horseback beside the road until just a few feet away. The rider gestured for him to stop. He recognized the local rancher and slowed to a stop. "Dr. Harvey, I thought it might be you," said the warmly bundled rider. "Not many Hudson automobiles make it out this way, even when the weather is good. Where are you headed?" Dr. Harvey replied, "Good to see you. I was just observing how beautiful this land is and feeling a little sorry for the cattle looking for a meal under the snow out there. I'm on my way to Swenson's homestead to see how the mister is doing. He's been ill. Might have influenza." The rancher responded with a request. My wife is also ill, maybe influenza too. She hasn't been able to get out of bed for the last 3 days. Would you mind stopping at our place to see her?" He replied, "I should be able to stop on my way back from the Swensons this afternoon. I'll be happy to see her." The rancher asked again, "Couldn't you see her now? She's very ill." He responded, "Mrs. Swenson's message indicated her husband is also very ill. I'll be back in just a few hours to see your wife before I return to town." "No, Doc," the rancher said. "You will see her now." He pulled a Winchester rifle from the scabbard attached to his saddle and pointed the rifle at Dr. Harvey. Dr. Harvey looked down the muzzle of the rifle. He had heard of a rancher in another county who had forced a physician at gunpoint to visit the rancher's home to see a severely ill family members. He had not heard whether or not there were repercussions for that rancher. The accusation sounded like a kidnapping to him. Events such as this reflected the high level of anxiety many people were experiencing during the influenza epidemic. He had not anticipated this action in Rosebud County. He decided the best course of action for him was to see the rancher's wife now and then go to the Swenson home. "You can put that rifle down. I'll see your wife. Would you like to get into the automobile and let your horse follow us down the driveway?" The rancher responded, "No, thank you, Doctor. I'll just ride behind your automobile." He drove very carefully down the snow-covered driveway towards the 2-story house about half a mile from Reservation Creek Road. He parked in front of the house next to a picketed area likely to be a flower garden in the spring. He carried his medical bag and walked with the rifle-carrying rancher into the house. The rancher instructed his 2 near-teenage sons to go to their room and stay there. They ascended the stairs without comment. "She is over here," the rancher said, and pointed to a room in one corner of the ground floor. Dr. Harvey found her lying in bed. She was alert enough to answer questions, but was also very weak. She had been ill for 6 days. At first she had fever, cough, and fatigue. 3 days prior, the fatigue intensified, and she began having trouble breathing. He took a thermometer from his bag and measured her temperature. It was only slightly elevated, but her breathing was labored. With his stethoscope, he heard little air moving into the left lung field. She had influenza with its most dangerous complication. He said, "You have pneumonia. Have you been using any treatment?" She spoke so softly he had to lean close to hear her response. "I have been taking cinnamon mixed with milk and putting cold towels on my forehead." He was aware of these common remedy steps and wouldn't discourage them. At a hospital, he would treat with supplemental oxygen by mask. At a large medical center, he might provide an anti-serum, about which he had read. But here in rural Montana, he could only offer aspirin to help keep her temperature down and provide some pain relief. He advised that she should stay in bed, drink plenty of fluids, and eat regularly to regain her strength. He concluded, "I need to get over to the Swenson home now." "Oh, I hope no one there is ill," she said softly, but with sincere concern. As he neared the front door, he heard the ranchers say remorsefully, "Doctor, I'm sorry I pulled my rifle on you. I hope you understand how worried I have been about my wife. Thank you for seeing her. How much should I pay you for this visit?" He replied tersely, "I do understand how concerned everyone is about influenza. My assistant will contact you after Thanksgiving about payment for the visit." The Hudson started after only 2 attempts with the starter. The driveway back to Reservation Creek Road was uphill, but the automobile traversed the incline despite some spinning of the tires. About 10 minutes later, he turned down the Swenson's driveway and followed it to the top of the knoll, from which he could see their house in the small valley below. He decided to park on the knoll and walk the remaining distance downhill. He did not want to chance getting the Hudson stuck in the steep return to the knoll top. It was now 2:30 p.m. The temperature had warmed a little, although it was still below freezing. Breathing the crisp, fresh air was invigorating. He proceeded down the driveway. The soles of his boots slipped a little with each step, requiring him to take short strides to avoid losing his balance. He looked ahead. His destination was a small house in a narrow valley surrounded by enormous, beautiful, but sometimes cruel land. He realized the chilled weather and snow-dusted ground was only a harbinger of the extreme temperatures and fence-post-topping snows winter could bring for months on end. He marveled at the homesteaders who could survive these conditions and thrive again when spring finally came. They would do this without electricity and without telephones. They would rely on the tenacity needed to hand pump water from wells themselves and their livestock, and to cut and split trees for wood to burn in potbelly stoves, which allowed a huddled homesteader families to emerge from their homes unfrozen day after day to look winter in the eye and declare, "We are here to stay." He wondered how many of the homesteaders would achieve their here-to-stay goal as the years went by. Coming up the driveway, bounding and barking, was Bingo. When the excited dog approached, Dr. Harvey removed the woolen glove on his left hand, reached forward, palm up, and said, "Hi, pal, thanks for coming to greet me." The dog sniffed his hand and came closer to his leg. He rubbed the tops of the dog's head and back. Bingo seemed satisfied for the moment, then turned and began running back down the driveway. Dr. Harvey followed. Several minutes later, they ascended the steps into the porch to be greeted by Amanda Swenson. "Doctor, I am so glad you came," she said. "Charles is very sick. He was not able to get out of bed yesterday, and again today. Please come in." "Let me see him," he said, slipping off his coat and gloves. As he moved toward the back bedroom, he noticed Bingo had come into the house too. He had lain beside Axel and Raymond, who were sitting near the stove. A crib, placed a safe distance from the stove, contained a bundle wrapped in a pink blanket, from which he heard babbling sounds. He found Charles in bed. Like the rancher's wife had seen earlier that day, Charles was responsive but weak, had labored breathing, and had a modestly elevated temperature. The stethoscope and examination suggested pneumonia, the unfortunately common complication of influenza Dr. Harvey had seen again and again in recent weeks. He again provided aspirin and had urged his patient to drink plenty of fluids and eat regularly. He and Amanda returned to the living room to join the boys and Bingo near the stove. "How have you boys been doing?" he asked. They each said fine. Neither elaborated, but both appeared healthy. Both were wearing wool socks and heavy pullover sweaters. He asked Amanda, "Did you make these beautiful sweaters? What a wonderful skill to have." She looked pleased, and he had noticed the result of many hours of knitting. "Yes, it's nothing, really." He looked at the piano sitting in the living room. He remained impressed by the presence of a baby grand, just as he had been when he had first visited this home. He said, "If I recall correctly, you brought this lovely piano from Iowa. Would you play something for me? She went to the piano, lifted the keyboard cover, and began playing for Elise. She was accomplished. The diminished chords she played with her right hand were haunting. There was no concert hall within 100 miles, yet he felt as if he were at one of the concerts he attended regularly in Chicago. He said, "Lovely. Beethoven would be very pleased to hear this." She finished the melody and said, "I love this instrument and the music. I want to teach Helen to play when she is bigger. Then we will share music with each other just as we share the middle name Elizabeth. Maybe someday she will have a daughter with whom she can also share a middle name and music." He looked into the crib at the face of the sleeping baby, her head topped by a pink wool cap and body warmly bundled in one blanket and covered by another. He asked, "How is little Helen doing? She must be about 15 months old now, if I recall correctly." "Yes, 15 months, Amanda replied. "She is doing well. I am keeping her away from Charles while he is ill. He misses her, but I pray she does not get this terrible influenza." Her tone shifted and she asked, "Would you stay for dinner? I don't know how to thank you for coming on a day like this." He declined the invitation, saying, "No, thank you. Hearing the piano played so beautifully was worth the trip. I want to get back to town before dark." He picked up his coat and gloves, which were warm from sitting near the stove. "I must be going." As Dr. Harvey was preparing to leave, Axel stepped into his boots by the front door and put on his heavy coat, wool hat, and gloves. He said, "I will walk with you to your automobile." He turned back to his mother and said, "While I'm out there, I'll put hay in the mow for the cattle and bring more firewood in the house." "Thank you, Axel," she said. "When you get back, Raymond will go with you to break the ice on the water trough in the barn and help pump more water for the animals." She looked at Dr. Harvey and said, "Thank you so much for checking on Charles." As the two made their way up the driveway, Bingo ran in large circles around them, occasionally coming close enough for a pat on the head and to jump up and lick Axel's face. Dr. Harvey asked about the chores the two brothers did each day. Axel listed feeding and watering the cattle and chickens, cleaning the barn, cutting firewood, and shoveling a path to the outhouse if the snow was deep. He also said his mother made sure they did school homework each day, too. When they arrived at the crest of the knoll, Axel asked, "When will school start again? I'd like to see my friends and my teacher." Dr. Harvey replied, "I don't know exactly when school will open again. It will be possible as soon as influenza stops spreading. I just don't know yet." He got into his Hudson, turned the key, and pushed the starter once, twice, and on a third try the engine sputtered to a start. He pushed down on the gas pedal to race the engine and then let the engine run. Through the partly open door, he thanked Axel for accompanying him. He secured the door, put the automobile in gear, and began a slow, careful drive back towards Reservation Creek Road. As he returned onto the road, he looked back and waved at Axel, who then disappeared along with Bingo to walk back to the house and to do the chores awaiting him. It was now nearly 3 p.m. Despite the slick roads, he was confident he would get home before dark. Granted, he was not intercepted for another home visit. The temperature was beginning to fall. The crust of ice atop the snow remaining on the road crunched under the Firestone cord tires. He reasoned that the lonely tire tracks he saw on the road ahead were probably the tracks he had left earlier that day. He held the steering wheel tightly with both hands, mile after mile. At 15 miles per hour, almost an hour passed before he reached the junction with River Valley Road, where he turned east toward town. He thought, if it were summer with hours of daylight remaining, I would stop to see Gerd and her family. But now I need to complete the last 5 miles of today's journey and get to town while some daylight remains. He turned on the Hudson's headlights. A train whistle in the distance pierced the quiet. The afternoon westbound train had left the station. In recent weeks, he had treated several railroad workers who had had influenza. He advised these men to stay away from work until their fever and cough resolved. This meant they would stay in town for a few days at the hotel, the Blue Front boarding house, or in one case, in a hospital bed at the Masonic Lodge. He wondered if railroad workers or passengers had brought influenza to Rosebud County. These workers were required to wear face masks when interacting with the public, but he remained skeptical about the efficacy of the mask. The role of the railroad system was evolving. It had been nationalized in December 1917 with the goal to make cargo transport more efficient, especially for carrying materials to support the war effort. He had read the nationalization could continue by law up to 21 months after the treaty had been signed. But he wondered how railroads would be affected by the decreased crop yields due to persisting decreases in rainfall. Less demand and less supply of wheat and other crops could not be good for farmers and ranchers, or for the railroad. Still, many railroad workers would continue to need medical care for years to come. As he parked near the Alexander Hotel, he said to himself, "The fate of the railroads and the ranchers is too much to think about right now. I need to assess patients at the Masonic Lodge and also see if May left any messages for me." He found that some patients at the temporary hospital were very ill, but no patient had died for more than 72 hours. He decided responding to messages at his office could wait until tomorrow. For supper, he had a sandwich and coffee in his room at the annex. Since the influenza epidemic arrived, he had stopped going to the cafe because he did not want to appear to be disregarding the public health ordinance he himself had recommended. He began reading a recent issue of the Journal of the American Medical Association, but was soon asleep. The next morning he heard a knock, knock, knock on the door. When he opened it, he was greeted by the hotel owner's son. "All the guests have answered," the young man said. "No need to call the funeral home today." Dr. Harvey was glad to learn this. However, it occurred to him that if he had received such a message prior to October, he would have found the news trivial. Now, though, the news brought relief and hope. He went to the Masonic Lodge. No one had died there overnight either. However, no patient was well enough to be discharged that day. He thanked the nurse for working on Thanksgiving. She replied, perhaps smiling under her gauze mask, "I enjoy working with patients while leaving all the meal preparation at home to my sister, her daughters, and my daughters. By the time I get home this evening, a wonderful meal will be waiting for our families to celebrate together." Next, he went to his office to read messages. One was from the mortician, who wanted Dr. Harvey to know only one casket was available, but more had been ordered. Another was from the State Board of Health, and summarized the epidemic in Montana from the beginning of October through the first 3 weeks of November. The number of influenza deaths among American Indians on reservations, highlighted in the report, was particularly troubling to him. Another striking observation in the report was the marked increase in the number of cases reporting during the week following November 11th. He had sensed an increase in Rosebud County, but had not taken time to summarize the case reports May had collected. Dr. Harvey had been concerned about the advice he had given Sheriff Starr in allowing relaxation of the prohibition of public gatherings. Had this facilitated a resurgence of influenza? The statewide data from the Board of Health suggested Armistice Day gatherings might have increased the spread of disease. Some cases might have been prevented by adherence to the ordinance. He was struck by the way reported disease information could be used to answer important disease control questions. He considered the value of evidence from disease reporting not only for formulating public health ordinances, but also for physicians and nurses to use in patient care. Years ago, he had read about Florence Nightingale and how she collected information about illness in field hospitals during the Crimean War. She had used the information to improve conditions for the ill and injured soldiers. He wondered how care hospitals in Europe during the recently ended war had been influenced by recommendations made decades before The Lady with the Lamp. Could systems for disease reporting be further improved or enhanced to support timely health ordinances or more valuable treatment decisions? He had read about a training program at Yale University School of Medicine to prepare physicians to work on public health issues. He planned to learn more about this program as he weighed whether or not to remain in Forsyth now that the war had ended. From his office, he walked the 6 blocks to May's home. He saw his exhaled breath condense before his face. He thought of the cattle breathing the cold air in the pasture yesterday, and their search for grass beneath the snow. His search for food was much easier. Once he had entered May's home, the aroma from turkey cooking in the oven instantly warmed him. In the dining area between the kitchen and living room, a table was already set for 8. May's family, a neighbor's family, and himself. On the white linen tablecloth were place settings, each consisting of a china plate, a china bread plate, a water glass with a red ribbon on the stem, a cup for coffee, a knife, a spoon, 2 forks, and a cloth napkin. Some food had already been placed on the table: mashed potatoes, pickles, aromatic bread rolls, orange slices, and fruitcake, along with containers of water and apple juice. Large platters with turkey and stuffing were being prepared in the kitchen. He could see pumpkin pies on the kitchen counter, too. The feast spread before him would surely be as delicious as it was meticulous. The sight and smell of this scene brought to mind his own family's Thanksgiving dinners during his childhood and adolescence. Since Marie died, he had been so focused on his grief, he had thought little about his family or about friends. As he realized this, he resolved to call his brother later that day and to talk with him about his family and neighbors from their childhood. Dinner was served, and the guests contrasted the royal treatment of this evening with wartime meals of recent years. May's husband said, "This is a delicious departure from our Hooverized diets." He was alluding to the diet recommended by Herbert Hoover, head of the U.S. Food Administration. In order to provide humanitarian relief to Belgium and other areas in war-ravaged Europe, the slogan "Food Wins Wars" had accompanied wheatless Wednesdays, meatless Tuesdays, and porkless Thursdays in 1917 and 1918 in the United States. After pumpkin pie with whipped cream, coffee, and then some brandy, Dr. Harvey thanked May for the wonderful afternoon. Rather than going directly to his room, he stopped at his office to make telephone calls. Before phoning his brother, he called the Mueller family. He dialed and waited for an answer. "Hello," said a voice he recognized. "Hello. Is this Gerd?" he responded. "This is Dr. Harvey. I hope you have had a wonderful Thanksgiving." After a long pause, he repeated, "Is this Gerd?" "Ja," came the voice on the telephone. "This is Gerd. Danke. Thank you for calling. We have had a good dinner. The Reverend and his Frau brought us food, but we are nicht wunderbar." Her voice had faded to silence, as he had a feeling she was about to cry. He knew the family was having a very difficult time since Mr. Mueller died. He had heard that the members of their church congregation had been visiting and helping with work at the ranch. He asked, "Do you have a few moments to talk? Is there something I can do to help?" Another long pause followed. "It's Sheer Schwieler. Frau Mueller is sehr traurig. She sits and looks out the window. She does not talk, not even to die Kinder. I try to help. I cook, and I keep the house clean. Die Kinder also help. It's hard for them. We have eggs and milk, eggs from Usiren Huron, and milk from Usiren Kuhn," came from the effusive answer from Gerd, who seemed to be relieved by sharing this information. But as she continued, the momentary relief he had sensed turned to despair. "Yesterday received the Sheer Schwier letters. I do not know what we can do. Can you tell me about these letters?" he asked. "Ja," she said. "It is sheer sure for all of us." She began to cry, but managed to continue. "One letter is from the bank. Das Lohn Herr Mueller used to buy wheat, seed, and fertilizer must be paid. The $600 has not been paid yet. The loan has been foreclosed. We will need to find a way to pay it. But that is not the worst news we received." She was sobbing. He could tell she was distraught. He talked while she cried. "I am very sorry to learn of this foreclosure notice. It is very insensitive of the bank to pursue this at a time your family is grieving, and at a time we are all asked to give thanks for blessing and mercy and to an end to sorrow and great peril. Have you received worse news than this?" Gerd composed herself enough to describe the second letter. She began, "Mein Schwester wrote the letter more than 3 weeks ago." The letter finally came. "Mein Mutter is dead." She was crying again, but continued. "She died in October. She had a fever from typhus. The war has been sheer schwer. Now mein Schweitzer and Bruder have nothing. I must find a way to be with them, for them to come here. But we have trouble here too. Es ist sheer schwer." She did not know what to say, but offered, "I am very, very sorry to learn this. So sorry for your loss." She said, "I'm glad you called. I have no one to talk with." After another long pause, she continued, Frau Muir has a Schwester who lives in Wells County. If I could contact her, maybe she would be able to help Frau Mueller und die Kinder. But I do not know her address or if she has a telephone. I would like to talk with her or send a letter. I have asked Frau Mueller, but all she says is her sister's name and the county where she lives." He asked, "What is her sister's name? I will ask May to look into this. It may be located a woman with that name in Wells County. Gerd replied with some hope in her voice for the first time during the conversation. Would you be willing to do that? Ich war Ihnen sheer grateful. Sei is Gurben Matilda Lehman, but now she heißt Matilda Bauer, who lives in Wells County. I heard Herr Mueller say that more than once when he was alive. He wrote this information on a piece of paper and tucked the paper into his pocket. I will work with May tomorrow to try to locate your aunt's sister. One of us will call to let you know what we learned, she replied. Danke, danke, danke. He concluded by saying, I am so very sorry for your loss. I wish I could have met your mother and to tell her how special her daughter is, but I'm sure she knew that. Vielen Dank, she replied with a pained voice. He heard the telephone disconnect. The conversation with Gerd left him saddened and exhausted. He decided to delay calling his own brother for another day. He had no desire to do any more at his office that evening. He walked to his room and prepared for bed. Before turning the light out, however, he again read the page in his medical journal with a notice about a public health training program at Yale.